I didn't care for Longlegs. Oz Perkins' horror mystery about a young FBI agent on the trail of a serial killer active across multiple decades has cemented its director as one of the most respected new faces in horror alongside Jordan Peele, Ari Aster, and Robert Eggers, but I don't see it. Longlegs hooked audiences with a lot of nods to horror classics: the underestimated FBI agent from Silence of the Lambs, the grotesque kills of Seven, the cipher from Zodiac, and the off-puttingly stiff dialogue of David Lynch, without really replicating the high points of any of those inspirations. Silence of the Lambs is interested in the male gaze and misogyny. Every man views Clarice with some form of objectification, as a pretty young woman or as a subservient protege, such that they are thematic accomplices of the serial killer Buffalo Bill who skins women. Hannibal Lecter stands out in the movie because he's the one character actually motivated by getting to know her.
Quid pro quo. I tell you things, you tell me things. Not about this case, though. About yourself.
Zodiac focuses on obsession. Protagonist Robert Graysmith is first characterized as easily distracted and late. We see him rushing to drop his son off at school and doodling in his sketchbook while behind the wheel. These dispositions make him enthralled when the paper he works for gets a coded letter from the Zodiac. The first half of the film portrays many of the serial killer's murders, but the second half shows a different kind of victim. Graysmith, his colleagues, and members of various police investigations who become obsessed with the case, neglecting important parts of their personal lives. Seven is most explicitly about sin, but more broadly about humanity's worst instincts and the fear that at least one of them could lurk within each of us.
How can I bring a child into a world like this? How can a person grow up with all this around them?
It's a bleak movie, and it matches that bleakness with sadistic creativity in each of its murders. I don't know how, nor do I really wish to nail down why the odd way Lynch directs his actors works as well as it does, but it's usually fascinating and enthralling. Doing all of this at once is busy. The ingredients of these movies in Longlegs are divorced from the through lines that made them work originally. Protagonist Lee Harker has an older male boss who is overbearing, and most of the murders in the movie are performed by men, but I didn't find it really did anything with this. The cryptic messages have even less relevance and say nothing about Harker's abilities because she's just given the answer. The murders, in the absence of something like Seven's thematic focus or the creativity of its crime scenes, just tells us that entire families have died, hoping that the scale of death will be disturbing alone. And sometimes characters feel naturalistic, while others, they speak in monotones, and I found no logic to or impact from it. I found these elements did little but emulate those films without really having purpose in this one. And on top of that, it fills out the rest of the horror movie bingo card with creepy dolls, 666, and devil imagery. I know this is negative, but it's frustrating because this film's success is not by accident. There is real technical mastery of suspense and cinematography, where you're always dreading something entering the empty part of the frame or letting your imagination run away with what's just off screen. Longlegs is a really good villain that manages to make Nicolas Cage, a guy famous enough to have made a movie about people being obsessed with him, completely disappear and twist his iconic energy into something unfamiliar. I think I'd like to have seen a movie that grew out of what makes this character scary rather than one so caught up in the scaffolding of other movies. And this got me thinking about what makes a good horror movie. And for me, articulating my own desires rather than creating a rigid framework, I want something at least heavily guided by fears deeply felt by the people making it. I mentioned a few directors who have entered modern acclaim who fit this. Ari Aster has used 3 films to explore failed responsibility and grief-motivated cruelty. Robert Eggers has emulated that feeling you get when you look at old Halloween costumes, the unsettling alienness of the past, across 4 vastly disparate time periods thus far. And of course, Jordan Peele has looked at the horrors of racism, inequality, and obsession with spectacle. They're making movies about things that work both upon deep analysis and as movies that make you go check all the closets in your apartment before you go to sleep, just in case. I think making a movie that instills fear in others requires understanding what prompts fear in yourself. And while thinking through what makes a good horror movie, I wound up watching a lot more horror movies than I would have otherwise. Horror is not a genre I naturally gravitate toward. I was really easily scared as a kid, and by the time I was a teenager and could handle them, I had a chip on my shoulder about watching critically important indie movies, which rarely included horror. I watched 10 other horror movies I'd heard good things about this summer, and I've ranked them and put together my thoughts on the places they do and don't work, with special attention to whether they reach a primal fear. To be clear, they don't have to be super deep. Number 1 on this list is not, and I'm also not holding horror to a unique genre standard. I think art is a form of communication and should be about sharing feelings. It's just with horror that feeling being shared is fear. Starting off at number 9 is The Pink Opaque. Not being a horror buff, I don't exhaustively know all the things this movie is paying homage to. I haven't watched Buffy the Vampire Slayer or 90s kids horror like Goosebumps or Are You Afraid of the Dark, but I have to wonder if there was something that made those works what they are that just wasn't replicated or expanded upon effectively here. This is about 2 teenage girls who live a few cities apart but can telepathically communicate and work together to fight this, moon presence that's haunting both of them. There's some fun effects. I think it evokes its inspirations successfully, but it doesn't have much going for it otherwise. I gather people really like like Buffy for its characters and their relationships, and there's nothing like that here. I also wonder if what worked in a 20-minute Goosebumps episode just feels dragged out over a 90-minute movie. The two main characters only see each other one time when they meet at summer camp, and there's something there in the pain of meeting those long-distance friends when you're young and don't really have the means to see them. And that longing both for friends that aren't by your side and the media that lit up your imagination as a child could inspire a world of work, but that's something I wish was at the core of it when it felt more like someone's DIY costume project that was really cool but didn't need to be a feature-length movie. Number 8 is A Quiet Place Day 1. There is a good movie in here. This is a prequel to A Quiet Place 1 and 2, and where those movies took place in remote areas long after an alien invasion, Day 1 has us actually seeing that invasion in the center of New York City. Our protagonist Sam has terminal cancer with little time left to live, which is such a clever way to have a central character in harmony with the audience. She knew she was dying before the story began, just as we know the Quiet Place world is going to end. It's not aiming at unpredictability, which prequels really can't achieve, and leans fully into the process of accepting death and the loss of your world. She starts the story understandably cynical, but becomes more connected to the humans around her as there are fewer and fewer of them left. I really liked her relationship with Nat Wolff's character, who plays a nurse at the group home she lives in. The mix of resentment and appreciation she demonstrates for him throughout the movie resonated with me because I've worked as a caregiver and have had that dynamic with clients where you sometimes have to give bad news or say no, but always return to a mutual respect for each other. Her relationship with Joseph Quinn's character, along with Quinn and his performance, are entertaining and meaningful as well. I struggle with articulating my feelings on acting because I don't have much of a background in it, but Lupita Nyong'o puts her full talent behind this character. Every role I've seen her in is radically different, and she's disappeared into each of them. I just wish the rest of the movie was as good as her performance and her character. I did not find it scary or creative. I don't know what the correct thing to do is after people know what the aliens look like from previous movies, but you see the aliens all the time so quickly, and I didn't find their design to be anything amazing. I just saw CG aliens. And so many scenes devolve into chase sequences that don't make use of the one cool gimmick this series has where the aliens can hear but not see. Make use of the one cool gimmick this series has where the aliens can hear but not see. This could be viewed as more of a disaster movie than horror, but I think it fails at that too. $60 million is a large budget, but it's not New York City falling apart money. What should have been the largest scale scene in the movie is a bunch of individual actors wandering through dust. I wish more of the horror came from character decisions that tied into Sam's development, but it doesn't. And the bright spots in character relationships are really just spots in a movie that's mostly people running away from CGI. Number 7 is Maxine. Maxine is a horror movie by the genre of its series and the tropes it uses, but that's wallpaper over a movie coming from very different impulses. If X was Ty West's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Maxine is his Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Looking back at 1985, he'd have been roughly the same age as Tarantino was in the time his movie was set. That's much harder to pull off. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood populates its world with impressions of what real people might have been like working in Hollywood in the 1960s. It's the kind of thing you need to read a ton of books and mainline media from the era to be able to do without feeling plastic or like empty nostalgia. Tarantino can do it, but Ty West can't quite. Maxine is populated with characters from 80s movies. The sleazy agent, the sinister PI, the punk video store employee. There's even a Bates Motel set shoehorned in. They had to bend over backwards pointing to a mostly unknown sequel made in the 80s, which incidentally starred Oz Perkins as a younger version of his dad, Anthony Perkins. X managed to tie all of its characters, even their cliches, back to a central horror of aging, the resentment of the young by the old for reminding them of what they used to be, the resentment of the old for making the young imagine what they would become, and attempts by men to control young women to stifle their fear of aging. Maxine doesn't have that focus, and instead my prevailing takeaway was that Maxine Minx is the coolest character on Earth and fuck anyone who gets in her way, which is fun, I guess. It's fun watching Kevin Bacon playing the most untrustworthy man on planet Earth. It's nice that someone cast Giancarlo Esposito as something other than Gus Fring. Wish they did more with him. Michelle Monaghan and Bobby Cannavale play two cops. But Maxine was never anything less than fun though, and the cast was more enjoyable than some of the child actors in the Pink Opaque. So almost everything in this video comes from trailers, and I've edited stuff out beyond that too, but while there's nothing graphic, this next entry involves broad discussion of intimate partner violence that I could see being distressing to some. So I wanted to say that up front, and you can skip to the time code on screen if you would like. It's not a movie I'm going to recommend either. Number 10 is Strange Darling. This one starts with a Fargo-esque text crawl at the beginning telling us it's a true story about the last victims of a serial killer active in Oregon in 2018. I lived in Oregon in 2018 when Wild Wild Country came out, and I know people here love their true crime as much as anywhere else, and that if this had been a true story, I would have heard about it, so I recognized it for the creative flourish that it was. There are a lot of creative choices in this vein, chapters told out of order, each with intriguing title cards, proud declaration at the beginning that it's shot on 35mm film. It's pulpy, rough, and violent cinema, and I think Strange Darling meets these stylistic flourishes with enough of its own talent to justify them, even if it's a bit eye-roll inducing. There's a visceral impact to everything in the movie. When it nails it, it fucking nails it. Every death is appropriately jarring and disturbing. I've never smoked a cigarette or done cocaine in my life, but this movie made me want to do both. There's a breakfast cooking scene, better than anything in all of the movies before this, and probably a few I've yet to mention. Then there's Willa Fitzgerald's performance. She makes her character work at so many different energies while still feeling meaningfully like the same person, selling it with every scream, bead of sweat, and cigarette drag. The film starts with Willa's character being chased by a date she previously trusted, and I think that's where the horror stems from. The fear involved in trusting someone in any sort of romantic situation, and that's in harmony with a movie told out of order, constantly withholding information and misleading you. The reason it occupies this place in the list of simultaneously 7th and 10th is both a reference to its structure and a way to articulate the intense uneasiness I have with how this movie handles its subject matter. When engaging with sexualized violence, I think there's some base level of conscientiousness I look for that this movie doesn't have. Most of it is in one scene and character introduced near the end, where I found the writing to be remarkably cruel while also being flat and boring. I enjoyed this movie up to then more than the three I just talked about because it had those high points. Most of its pieces worked well together and had a reason to be there. It is doing better at the things I've complained about thus far in this video, but it also left me with a worse taste in my mouth than any of these other movies. I am wary of implying art must agree with me to be good, or that even the point of art is to improve society through expressing opinions. But I also think that most people have a limit, whether they realize it or not, where however competently a film is put together and however engaging its drama, there are lines unique to each individual that they don't want it to cross. And personally, I think the way this movie handles sexual assault is more objectionable than being a bit derivative or using too much CGI. Number 6 is Oddity. You know, this is the first movie on the list that actually scared me, other than this one scene of someone being buried alive in the Pink Opaque that's weirdly scarier than the rest of that movie. Oddity is about a couple who move into an old house in the English countryside. The husband is a doctor in a high-security psychiatric facility. The wife has a creepy sister who works in a store full of supernatural trinkets, and there's a bunch of creepy puppets, masks, and it all works together. Every piece is motivated, the sister's superstitions and the doctor's rationality are placed at odds with each other, and the movie derives a lot of fear from both the fantastical and the hyper-rational or the clinical. It's interested in superstition and dolls, not because dolls are scary as a trope, but because it wants to examine what we fear in the unknown or unexplainable. And plot-wise, it's a lot of guns Chekhov being loaded and satisfyingly set off. I was scared in a lot of ways throughout that I don't think would be diminished on a rewatch. This movie is really patient and willing to build dread and have terror come from slow realizations rather than jump scares. It's willing to have something in the environment let you see it and become familiar with it, and still manages to have it scare you in a way that's unexpected. If there's anything that holds this one back for me, it's a problem with stiffness. The characters who play the largest role in it were the ones that felt the least interesting on screen, even if it wasn't to a horrendous degree. Even if it wasn't to a horrendous degree. To a horrendous degree. It's missing something like Fitzgerald's performance in Strange Darling, or even Nick Cage's in Longlegs for that matter. But I think it makes up for this by having the best ending of probably anything on this list, and that's exactly where you want your movie to peak. Number 5 is Trap. Josh Hartnett's show.
Sorry, I just needed some air. There was an accident in the kitchen. I freaked out. A friend got burned.
Trap is about a dad going to a concert with his teenage daughter. He's teasing his kid, trying to match her enthusiasm and making a bunch of dad jokes. Only...
You know the butcher? The freaking nut job that goes around just chopping people up? Well, the feds or whatever heard that he's gonna be here today. So they set up a trap for him.
And he is the killer. It's incredible how these two elements, a dad channeling his love for his daughter into a hammy enthusiasm for a pop artist, and his attempts to appear a good-natured, law-abiding citizen to authorities meld so well together. From the jump, he sells being that dad. I have that dad. I've seen so many people being that dad. There's a lot of media about characters lying, and especially lying to police, but the hammy dad lying is a fresh version of it. This idea and how well Hartnett it executes it deserves so much credit that I don't feel the film always gets. It also nails the feeling of going to a concert as a teenager, all the songs having their own associated gags, the merch stands, the other kids who will talk about this at school later. They manage to capture the experience of being an audience member enough to lend the film some plausibility, even if every line of dialogue is pulling in the opposite direction. It's an M. Night Shyamalan movie, and he has this weird way he likes his characters to talk sometimes that's super wooden, but I think after having this stylistic choice fall flat for over a decade, he's finally figured out how to make it work. The dialogue is tweaked in such a way that when characters talk, it's like you're high and you don't want them to know, but they know. It's reflecting the experience of the main character back onto the diegetic world of the movie. When this movie fails, it fails in a way that isn't even that wild Shyamalan twist. It just loses a lot of steam towards the back end. Luckily, it's in a way that's pretty excisable from the rest of the movie. The build-up throughout stands on its own, and it's the kind of thing that I think would work on rewatches. This is the only movie on this list that isn't in the green on Metacritic, and even if I'm not in the minority calling it a masterpiece, the things that it does well with its main character, its setting, and in channeling Shyamalan's weird wrapped in plastic dialogue, I think it's worth seeing, and as much as this was helped by watching it in theaters, I think it would be immensely fun to watch with a group of friends at home. Number 4 is Cuckoo. Cuckoo centers on the horror of being an adolescent, being mature enough to have your own habits, opinions, and goals while still lacking the independence to steer your life as you see fit. Gretchen, played by Hunter Schafer, has gone to live with her dad, his new wife, and their daughter at a resort in the German Alps after living with her mom for most of her childhood. Schafer does a great job conveying the pain and helplessness in the situation, and every other character is perfectly engineered to make things even worse for her. Her parents don't take her seriously. When her half-sister starts having unexplained seizures, they take it out on her, and the other adult in her life, the resort's manager, gives her a job but allows her little independence and is cagey as to why. He's played by Dan Stevens, who rocks. It's been a decade since The Guest, and I still get excited to see him and stuff after just how good that was. And he delivers here. There's this awkwardness, I think, between Americans and Europeans, where Europeans are a lot more direct, and he drives right through that awkwardness in every scene.
Your family belongs here.
That's a fucking weird way to put it.
The thing I like most about him in this and in The Guest is that he's having the time of his life and playing a character where that isn't annoying. I also love the sterile alpine architecture. It creates a really nice contrast with the main character who listens to punk music and was in a punk band back home to be trapped in this land of slightly accented beige. Fitting with having a musician main character, it does fantastic things with sound. Music and different noises in the environment burrow into your head in a way I haven't experienced since the Suspiria remake. There's also an effect used to give the feeling of being stuck in place, running but not getting anywhere, stuck in stasis, stuck in place, running but not getting anywhere. That builds suspense for what will finally happen when the repetition ends. It's not the scariest movie on earth. I'd recommend not looking at the trailer because they spoil the most frightening shots of the movie, which I've cut out of this video. But where it's not scary, its characters are entertaining and endearing enough, and the emotions it aims at are broader than fear, so it's satisfying regardless. Number 3 is Alien Romulus. I don't think there's a bad Alien movie. Even if it's a little dull, 3 isn't without its merits, and the resurrection is tonally out of place. It's a fun 90s camp movie when viewed as its own thing. Romulus doesn't need those kind of caveats though. It's a gripping sci-fi movie that breaks new ground in the series and manages to loop a ton of the influence that the series has had on the rest of sci-fi media back into itself without mostly getting too gratuitous about it. All the main characters work on a shitty company planet where you're stuck until you finish your contract, and your contract is always extended. Alien distinguished itself somewhat from other sci-fi with the working class nature of its crew. They weren't soldiers or pioneers, but just long haulers trying to get the job done, finding themselves equally expendable to both the aliens that will rip them to pieces and the company that will let them die if it causes their profits to go up. Romulus shows new parts of the Alien universe, but they're parts that feel like they could have been there all along. I liked the new Ridley Scott movies, but they do a thing where even though those movies are set before the original Alien, which had the 1970s imagination of future technology, they opt for technology that still looked futuristic by 2010 standards. Romulus instead returns to the 70s imagination of the future. Where the Ridley sequels have the floatiness of holograms, this instead has the weight of mechanical doors and clickety-clackety keyboards. The ships feel big, and docking them is a whole process with a bunch of things locking into place and metal screeching. It's not sleek and aspirational, it's gritty metal as weathered as the film's cast of characters. I found it very easy to root for the small group of 20-somethings pulling off a heist in an abandoned Weyland-Yutani space station. I think it's a fair assessment that these characters aren't as fleshed out as many from the two Alien movies that everyone agrees are good, but neither of them puts the same work into establishing the environment that their characters are trying to escape, so it's okay that some of them just feel like broadly good people with smaller personalities. I even really liked the designated shithead character. There's been a lot of praise rightfully heaped onto Kaylee Spaney and David Johnson, but I also loved Spike Fern as Bjorn. He's able to sell his brash attitude as a product of living his whole life as a disposable laborer, and he does something with a cigarette that's probably the second best shot in the movie. It's very clever to have him be primarily mean to a robot character where it generates both hatred for him but also sympathy because to him he's yelling at a microwave. Besides its wonderful dedication to practical effects, its biggest strength is a conscientiousness about how to emulate its influences without becoming gratuitous. It's careful to take scenarios and dynamics that worked in previous Alien movies and replicate their feelings and ingredients rather than shamelessly repeating quotes or forcing dead characters into things. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. And answer the question, what made Alien and Alien scary, with a series of new unique scenarios it can claim full ownership over. I also find the influence of video games on this fascinating. I saw Aliens for the first time when I was 15 and learned just how many games I'd already played were influenced by the franchise. Romulus's director, Fede Alvarez, is a gamer. He based the design for one of his characters in The Last of Us Part 2, said Alien Isolation had an impact on his creative process, and I haven't seen any confirmation, but I get the sense he's played Dead Space 2. It's fun to see the influence the series has had on another medium come back around and be expressed in its films. The real tragic thing is that this movie has two really conspicuous pieces of fan service. One a single line and one an entire character that was really poorly thought out. I wish they weren't there, but sometimes I just love a movie so much I'm able to let things like that go. Writing about media is so much more exhausting when I feel like I need to litigate every choice, and the most important truth here is that this is just the horror movie that worked the third best for me, and I'm willing to think of those missteps as small so I can enjoy everything else around them. Number 2 is the substance. My original criteria for this list was that they be 1, listed as a horror movie on Google, and 2, be released between May and August. This second rule was so I could draw the line somewhere and didn't need to see Speak No Evil after watching the trailer for it before pretty much all these other movies, but the substance was so good I needed to bend that rule. Demi Moore plays an actress who loses her job on an aerobic exercise TV show so the network can replace her with a younger actress. Emotionally wounded and without a job, she decides to take a mysterious substance that will help her retain her youth. Like X, The Substance is a film about obsession with feminine youth. It's not subtle about this. Dennis Quaid shows up like 3 minutes in as a loud, cartoonish misogynist. You get what this movie is about very quickly, but that's okay. It's ramming a nail into your skull, and even if the nail can't go any deeper, it's still gonna hurt like hell when they pound on it. If you're someone who doesn't like gore in movies, if you have problems with viscera or bodily fluids, just don't. Someone in my showing sprinted out of the theater to the bathroom at one point. I tend to think I've seen a lot of things in movies, and I was like 5 minutes from doing the same thing. This is peak gross practical effects. Between the quality of prosthetics and nauseating squishing noises, you grasp the texture everything would have if you were to run your hand over it. It's representing real societal desires and expectations with the most grotesque images and letting the audience's disgust build and build and build. It's both a roller coaster of a gross out movie that always manages to ratchet up one more level, and a clever societal critique, with the two complementing each other. Not just one of the best horror movies, but Coralie Farjad has made one of the best movies of the year, period. I'd also recommend seeing her other film, Revenge. It was one I remember hearing about years ago, but never made the time for until The Substance came out. I think it's a movie that hits harder having seen The Substance and seeing what she's going for stylistically. Same praise to that movie on practical effects, real nasty and painful looking injuries. Also has the coolest use of a beer can in any movie ever. Check them both out. Okay, so I gather this is a bit of a hot take. Number 1 is Inv Violent Nature. Inv Violent Nature follows this undead, hulking murderer as he attacks a group of college students vacationing at a remote cabin. It's nearly all from the killer's perspective. A lot of long shots of him slowly walking through the woods. This movie is patient, and for some that translates to boredom, but I would not have traded a frame of it. These shots are beautiful, and each step builds evidence that he is constantly on the move, closing the distance between himself and the foolish teenagers who stole his locket. It's the rare horror movie that manages to be terrifying in broad daylight, which is very fitting for a movie where the killer, usually hidden until a moment of surprise, is nearly always visible. It's not aiming to startle but build a sense of impending doom, and it does so wonderfully. All the deaths and gore strike a perfect balance of campy and elaborate. Each kill is creative and distinct. They capture both the creative zeal of someone who's watched a lot of horror movies and the cruelty of the protagonist. They're so over the top that it's hard to feel sorry for people getting killed, but you can also tell how much care and effort went into making them convincing enough. It punches so much higher than its weight class in terms of effects for a $3 million movie. It's across the board clever with how it uses its resources. You can't pay a ton of professional actors with this budget, so often rather than have people on screen with a bunch of close-ups, we get scenes where we hear voices but are stuck in the killer's perspective quite a distance away. This not only makes up for some acting shortcomings, but creates a haunting feeling of learning about these characters through the eyes of someone who wants them dead. I'll admit, some of the acting did get on my nerves. These college students are really fucking annoying, to a point beyond recognizability, not selling themselves even as a parody of real people. But I think it might actually work. It's about a monster stomping what he perceives to be obnoxious ants, and them being so annoying makes the outside world agree with the inside world of the killer. You become as furious with them as he is, and I wonder whether some of the campy over-the-top violence would sit as well if these seemed more convincingly like real people. This is number one because it's constantly getting better with each thing that makes you scared building on top of the last. I've talked mostly about it as a silly slasher film, but somehow it manages to also be genuinely terrifying, and you don't notice until you're completely petrified and realize you have been for the past 20 minutes. It's fitting starting this list with the Pink Opaque, which drew from a lot of influences, but I didn't feel did much with it, to a movie paying homage to its own canon of media, but hyper-focused on its villain and specifically his determined walk, always closing the distance between you and him. I'm not asking for every movie to be an allegory or require deep dissection to understand. I'm asking it to be confident in the elements it can call its own and how they generate fear. Thank you so much for watching and for sticking around till the end. I'm really happy I was able to get this out before Halloween. I did a bunch of rewrites on it and finally got to a point where I felt like I just needed to power through and get it out there. I know you're used to hearing this all the time, but if you enjoyed this type of thing, I'm gonna be making more of it, so subscribe to the channel if you want to see more. Appreciate you. In 1996, Owen is 12 years old, going to vote with his mom at the local high school. He runs into a girl a few grades older than him reading the written companion guide to a TV show she likes. It's called The Pink Opaque. Owen is interested in the show, but he can't watch it because it's on past his bedtime. So the two form a secret bond around it. Owen lies to his mom about going to another friend's house for a sleepover and instead watches the show with Maddie. She also begins recording the show and gives the tapes to Owen after school. Both their lives lack tender moments. Owen's mother is terminally ill and his dad is gruff and unexpressive. Maddie's parents fight every night. They both find solace in the TV show about two teenage girls who are confident and powerful. If a horror movie is one that strives to trigger a fight or flight response to raise your heart rate or make you leave a light on when you fall asleep, I Saw the TV Glow is not one, but it is about fear. The fear that the world won't accept you for who you are, and that even coming to the clearest understanding of your identity and your dreams, you will turn away from them for the sake of others. I Saw the TV Glow is a trans allegory, and it's one I connect with as a non-binary person, but I think its impact is even more far-reaching than that. You don't have to be queer to have hopes or parts of yourself you've turned away from that are deeply painful to you. Memory of childhood feelings of wonder, creativity, or peace that you hope aren't gone forever but can't seem to get back to. Counter to the sentiment I expressed when I was pretending that The Pink Opaque was a movie, I Saw the TV Glow is a perfect example of understanding the significance of nostalgia not as a finger-wagging critique of canonizing the media you enjoyed as a child, but reveling in the power of something that captures your imagination and makes you feel alive, beyond what a few lines on a TV set should be capable of. I've complained about movies being wooden or having non-realistic acting choices, and I find this is one where those choices are purposeful and emotionally devastating. Watching this movie means signing up to be with characters who are deeply unhappy, but it's for the sake of making room for the bright spots to really shine, and they definitely do. I'm trying to work on expressing things I like about things, because writing the script for this, I found the earlier entries were a lot longer than the later ones because of all the little gripes I was fitting in, and it made me sad to process my work that way. But another facet is that things I don't like about something are often either broad or granular and easier to talk about without spoiling, where the best parts of something are the bits that emerge from really digging into it, and I don't want to spoil any more of this movie than I already have. I have a hard time imagining this not being my favorite film of the year by its end, and I hope it could mean as much to someone else watching this video as it has to me. Thanks for watching.